Good afternoon. As someone who knows how hard it is to fill this room, I really appreciate you all hanging in here late in the afternoon. Very impressive. I really want to thank Rob and the Chamber Foundation for including me and the U.S. Chamber in this important discussion. The Chamber has supported building smart, modern, resilient infrastructure and has made preparedness and pre-disaster mitigation among our top policy priorities. You may have heard many times today regarding our work on the economics of resilience, that together with our foundation and Allstate, we developed a preparedness payoff report that said for every dollar invested in pre-disaster mitigation and resilience projects and measures, there are $13 in reduced losses and economic savings. While we can't eliminate losses due to disasters, we can reduce their impact on the economy. Less effect on jobs, GDP, and incomes means less effect on communities, companies, people, and that economies recover more quickly. There is an appropriate federal role in investing in reducing risks for companies and communities, and that's what we're here to discuss today. Mitigation is a critical component of building resilient communities, extending far beyond the scope of the federal government. So I want to introduce our panel of experts today. First, to my immediate right, we have Roy Wright, President and CEO of the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS. We have Carol Haddock, who's a professor in the practice at Rice University, and online, and an example of a resilient conference and a resilient effort. Danielle Del Sol, who's director of the Preservation Center of New Orleans, was stuck in New Orleans because of storms last evening. So really important that we have Danielle, Carol, and Roy here today. So I want to start with you, Roy. I know that IBHS has been working on significant wildfire efforts. Can you share what is driving the work and can highlight recent lessons learned from Maui and Southern California wildfires from earlier this year?
Yeah, it's great to be with you all, and thanks for having us. You know, our work on research, we crash test buildings, is usually what IBHS is known for, but everything done at full scale, and we can do that against wind, rain, and hail, but wildfire's really been kind of the forefront of this. We're the only facility where we can recreate wildfire ember storms and test that kind of sequence of how fire moves from structure to structure in a controlled environment. Yet we also bridge that directly post-event in terms of what we can do on the ground. We want to collaborate and we want to actually calibrate in that space. We did this after every one of the major conflagrations over the last decade. So we had been in Lahaina some 2 years ago, and we're on the ground just 5 days after the burns. We're not going to stop the kind of ignitions that took place here. When you have a conflagration that requires humans, it requires drought, and it requires wind. And in this case, a flash drought's there in California, and you see what moves through. But when we show up, we're not looking for the ash, we're actually looking for what survived. We want to understand why it survived, because in learning from that, can we replicate it? And the pieces on wildfire are both about the parcel and home as well as the neighborhood. And we saw in stark relief, because when home survived, usually it wasn't just a single home, although there are some of those. Usually there was an island of 4 to 8 homes, where 2 or 3 of them had enough of the right features to be able to withstand the embers that were showering their way and then protect the ones that were behind. And so we're in a space coming out of this by which California and Los Angeles are looking to us and saying, okay, then how do we rebuild? And there are clear pathways on how to rebuild to be able to withstand the ember cast, which drives most of the ignitions, as well as the structure to structure that happens in high density. But I'll tell you, part of what we're learning, and the even steeper hill to climb, is can we convince across Los Angeles County, across LA, across California in the West, to implement those on what hasn't yet burnt down? Can we narrow those paths of destruction?
Thanks so much, Roy. Carol, turning to you, as you led Public Works in Houston, the built environment is a significant factor for both mitigating and exacerbating hazards. And if we're looking at things beyond wildfires, from your experience there through Hurricane Harvey and other hazards such as drought, what did you learn, and where do you see opportunities for applying those lessons in other communities?
So I spent almost 20 years at the City of Houston, the last 7 as the Director of Public Works. During that time, we had 7 nationally declared disasters. Most of them are flooding. In Houston, flooding is our what we've always traditionally thought of as our big risk. What we found in the last 15 or 20 years is that drought and freeze and wind, and there are other things beyond just flooding and tropical systems that are coming our way. And so what I really appreciate what Roy said is what you're always looking for is what went right, what didn't go bad in this particular previous storm. And what we saw in Hurricane Harvey is that the human response went really well. Neighbors helping neighbors, the resilience of the community, all those things. But that's not what you want to rely on in your long-term strategy. You want to rely on modern building codes. You want to rely on mitigation that identifies those areas of highest risk and takes people out of that risk for future events. You want to do site-specific. You want to do small regional, and you want to do large regional projects to do that. Probably one of the best examples in Houston is actually the Texas Medical Center that took it upon themselves to make themselves almost an island, not impact anyone else, but so that they could stay in operation throughout any event that came at them. They did during Winter Storm Uri, they did during Hurricane Harvey, but during Tropical Storm Allison, which happened in 2001, they lost water, electricity, and they had buildings flooded. So it is that how do you make sure that the next time that you've learned what happened and you're applying it moving forward? Another big part is having the conversation with the community, because when something happens to them, and we've heard this throughout the day already, people want to get back to normal as quick as possible. They want to get back to exactly the way it was. And you have to have them primed for the conversation that your old normal is not the risk you want to live in. You want a different normal. You want one that does provide mitigation, that provides safety, that reduces your risk, that doesn't make you go through this life-changing experience again, that you don't have to go through that. And so there are, lesson after lesson after lesson, and I'm excited to hand this off to New Orleans because they're very similar in many of the stories that they've gone through and how you preserve and adjust.
Well, thanks so much, Carol. Danielle, as the 20-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina nears, how are you focusing on strengthening historic structures and neighborhoods to reduce the impact of hurricanes and other risks in your area? And where do you see advances in what New Orleans has been doing that you can apply elsewhere?
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you all today. Interestingly, we're looking at historic wisdom. So the vernacular architecture here in New Orleans was appropriate for our climate. When people first settled here, this was a swamp. It flooded. It has always flooded. And so homes were raised off the ground. And through the years, people have wanted to reclaim square footage and maximize square footage. And so if homes have been raised off the ground, those areas might have been enclosed, turned into apartments or little storefronts. And so now we have a situation where thousands of people have homes or buildings where the bottom floor originally was meant to flood if needed, and you wouldn't have kept something valuable on that bottom floor. You would have lived upstairs. But now those are being used as residences or businesses. And so what we are having to do is help people figure out how to essentially give up that usable space. And it's a painful thing to do. But insurance companies will no longer insure these first level floors that were once part of a building, and not meant to be inhabited. So that's one thing we're having to do to help homeowners of historic buildings that were originally lifted off the ground to respond to this flooding. For those that weren't, and people want to raise their buildings off the ground, we're seeing a lot of that too. And we're helping people figure out how to keep the historic integrity of their buildings intact while elevating them off the ground. So that's been an interesting challenge. With Roy's program, fortified roofs have been a game changer in the Gulf South region. Not only are they positively impacting insurance rates for all of us, but they are amazing in the way that they help strengthen a home towards extreme wind and water intrusion. And water is, of course, the #1 problem for buildings in New Orleans, whether it be a historic rainstorm or just day-to-day extreme humidity, moisture in the air. Water intrusion is what kills our buildings. And so the fortified roof system has really done a huge amount towards strengthening our buildings. And luckily, the state of Louisiana has a grant program that's helping more and more people put these roofs on their homes. And then finally, we're having, as historic preservationists, to look outside of our traditional toolbox. And we're really looking towards landscape architecture and how living with water and mitigating concrete and impermeable pavement throughout our city is harming us with flooding. And so we are trying to help residents site by site at their homes figure out how to get rid of concrete and replace it with plantings or permeable pavement, so that on their site, when there is a flood event, the ground will absorb as much of the water as it can instead of running off and pooling and flooding. And so we're seeing lots of improvement in flooding impact when even just a few houses on a block undergo this effort. But that's a lot of money to spend and a lot of people that need to do it. So it's going to be a long game effort for sure.
Well, thanks so much, Danielle. And I'm glad that you mentioned going outside your toolbox, because that, when we think of pre-disaster mitigation measures, we think that you need all the tools in the toolbox in order to move forward. We can't leave anything off the table. And so, Roy, where are you seeing traction in the adoption of mitigation, hardening, retrofits, and other IBHS initiatives? And have you seen evidence that mitigation helped communities reduce their overall disaster risks?
So let me pull the string on something Daniel just mentioned. Fortified means a few things, but particularly focus on, from a retrofit perspective, on roofs. And Alabama led the way in this space after hurricanes in 2004, and the coastal communities put things into codes, got the development community on board, found ways to have insurers recognize this, and also put a grant program in place. What we saw play out when Hurricane Sally came and made a direct hit is homes that had fortified roofs had fewer claims and less severe claims. I'll be clear with you. If a tree falls on your house, even if you got a fortified roof, the tree fell on the house, you got an insurance claim. But we have something that could withstand what was coming and could shed that water. What's so amazing to me, though, about the Alabama example is they get held up, and usually in rooms like this, they're first highlighted that says, hey, they've got a grant program. And by the way, they do. It's entirely state-funded. Note conversations earlier today. They have never put FEMA or federal dollars into their grant program. It's always been funded by the state. And those grants constitute 17% of the fortified roofs in the state. The private market has stepped into that place, and that engine is actually moving in that direction. What gets someone to this point? It's when a state experiences a multitude of these hurricanes, and the point by which their insurance price point says, hey, you got a risk and it's got to change. Louisiana is just a couple years into this program, clearly with Laura, Ida, Delta all hitting them. They've had to lean into that space. They need to keep on keeping on in that space, which is often hard for politicians to do. But where we sit today, they are already at a point where 40% of them are through grants, and 60% of it is playing out on the private sector side. There are incremental ways to do that, and there's corollaries that play out west when it deals with wildfire protection, where again, someone can take an action. Oftentimes when you're replacing a roof, but out west, it's changing some of the landscaping. It is a few $1,000s. It's not free. But they're the kind of things that didn't require you to go take out a loan to refinance your home to do it, but you could narrow the paths of destruction.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And what it sounds like is that the state grants are spreading the risk. They're that first loss risk that unlocks the private market there. And so I think want to turn to you, Danielle, in that regard. And what does it look like in New Orleans specifically after Katrina, and how is the mitigation measures faring there?
We were blessed, because our disaster was so extreme, and really, I feel like we live in a world now where we're having extreme events every year. And Katrina was 20 years ago. We were kind of at the tip of that spear. And so we did receive a $14 billion investment from the Army Corps of Engineers to rebuild our levee system. But we still have a bowl that will fill with water in extreme rain events. And that does not mean a named hurricane. It can be a Thursday and it just starts raining and it doesn't stop for several hours. And we have parts of the city that flood significantly. And so we have to be more of a city that lives with water. And luckily, the city of New Orleans has adopted that with measures largely funded by FEMA and HUD. But there's an example that I'd love to share, a neighborhood called Pontchartrain Park, which is very close to Lake Pontchartrain. It was the first planned community for African-American residents in New Orleans, and it was built in the 1940s and 50s. And it is lovingly referred to as the Black Mayberry. It was an incubator for excellence for Black families in the city. And it flooded severely during Hurricane Katrina, 8 to 9 feet of water that sat in the neighborhood for days. And so a lot of the historic ranch houses that were built during the neighborhood's development were lost. A lot of them had to be significantly altered, gutted. And the neighbors were resilient in the best sense of the word. They were determined that they were going to come back, rebuild. There was no question. And so they worked with the Preservation Resource Center to try to get the neighborhood on the National Register of Historic Places, which we were proud to help them do. But they had been denied twice by the National Park Service because so much had been lost during Katrina and they didn't have historic integrity of their homes anymore. And so we convinced the Park Service that it was more about a cultural resiliency that needed to be honored and recognized. And luckily the Park Service agreed. And at the same time, the city of New Orleans invested $15.5 million into turning the golf course in that neighborhood. It was the first golf course that African Americans could use in the city of New Orleans, into a green infrastructure project that holds 8 to 9 million gallons of water per year. And so could mitigate as much as 14 inches of rain flooding in a 10-year rain event. And so now this neighborhood has rebuilt. They are nationally recognized for their excellence of resilience, and they have the green infrastructure investment to help them weather the next storm. And we're so proud of that holistic effort to help this neighborhood come back.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Carol, what are some of the best practices around building and rebuilding that are relevant to infrastructure? I know you have been talking about the ASC most recent report card, so why don't you give us a little download on that?
So absolutely. So, every 4 years, the American Society of Civil Engineers does release our report card. Our 2025 report card came out in May and March. And, one of the things that we use, 6 categories that we use to evaluate existing infrastructure: capacity, condition, funding, innovation. But one of the big ones that has come in the last few years has been resilience. Communities rely on infrastructure. The infrastructure is that foundation that supports those communities. So you don't have those communities without the infrastructure, and it has to perform. It has to perform, and it can perform okay, and things can recover and resilience can go on, or you can have catastrophic failures. We've seen those. Sometimes those are natural disasters. Sometimes those are man-made disasters. I mean, we've seen bridge failures in recent years in Baltimore that were not natural disasters, but we also saw the levee failures in Katrina in New Orleans. We've seen, the Gulf Coast when Harvey hit, there weren't necessarily levees that failed, but the infrastructure was just completely overwhelmed. And so what is the thing that you can do? The problem with infrastructure is it's typically built for decades. The life cycle of infrastructure is built for well beyond any one generation, usually. And most of our infrastructure that's in place today, and you saw that in New Orleans, was built for not a changing climate. And so we have to reevaluate that infrastructure every time we experience this, and we have to look at it and we have to ask ourselves, is it ready for today? And is it future ready? And sometimes you can use innovation to get there, but sometimes you're going to actually be physically altering that infrastructure to be able to handle what it is that's coming at it, whether it's changing the roofs to deal with the embers, whether it's changing the heights of the levees or the strength of the levees or rebuilding the levees, or whether it's actually putting in parallel systems. You don't want to get rid of systems that are working fine, but you do want to increase the capacity if you're dealing with flooding and more flooding. And I don't know if y'all caught that. I'm an H&H person. 14 inches of rain, 10-year storm. Goodness, what's your 100-year storm? I know ours in Houston is 17, 18 inches now in 24 hours, and I'm assuming New Orleans is probably similar. That's a lot of rain that our infrastructure, most of Houston was designed for 2 to 5 inches of rain. And now we're expecting it to take 17 to 20 inches of rain in that single day. So you just have to, you have to be smart with every dollar you invest.
Important to note that if you look at the overall report, it says that we have a C- as a country, and that is keeping in mind that that means that we just have to, it's just rebuilding what we have. And so really, it's not building it to a better standard. And so
Well, the good news is it's a C this year.
Sure.
So we actually, we climbed from C- to C on the nationwide average. Still not something to be proud of, but it is an improvement and a direct reflection on the amazing investment that happened over the last 4 years. And we should see more improvements over the next 4 years as that money, and I'm gonna be positive, as that money continues to pour into projects. But I will also say that if we don't continue to invest in that, we've still got a $3.7 trillion funding gap just to get to a state of good repair.
I think that segues nicely to kind of the next set of questions. So, Carol, what role do government policies and financial incentives play in encouraging homeowners to invest in mitigation measures, and how can they be improved to enhance community resilience? And also think about, we also talked about kind of that non-federal investment. So if you can mention that, that'd be helpful.
So the rubber meets the road at the local level, and that is where politics and building codes and investment fight each other on a daily basis. Your local entities are competing with their neighbors. They're trying to attract businesses. They're trying to attract residents. They're trying to make it easy to move and invest and live and work in these areas. And protected building codes, a lot of times in their minds, work against that, because what they're hearing is you're making it too expensive to be here. And so one of the things that we have to do at the local level is we have to recognize that it's more expensive to recover than it is to invest appropriately up front. And you know, there are people that are betting that we're not going to have that disaster, but you definitely have to plan ahead of time. And that's, you know, the private investment is that up front. But also, and I was talking with Chuck ahead of time, I said, you know, maybe the federal government needs to start giving credit for the private mitigation investment that's happening when they're coming in post-disaster, and say, hey, if you've been a responsible city, that we ought to be using your previously invested mitigation as part of your local match, making sure that some of that counts, that it gives you an incentive to take the time to invest up front.
Yeah, we do need more tools in the toolbox to make sure that communities have the funding that they need in order to implement these measures. Roy, what are some of the most cost-effective mitigation strategies that homeowners and small businesses implement to protect their properties from severe weather?
Yeah, so across areas that have hurricanes and severe convective storms, it's about the roof, it's about the roof, it's about the roof. As we work out west, we're looking at wildfire dimensions. Roofs are important on that side, but most folks have already moved beyond the wood shake shingle, which is the vulnerability on the wildfire side. It then turns to things like attic vents. It only costs $50 to upgrade those. It's a do-yourself kind of piece. And then the changes around your house, the 5 feet closest to your home. I think what becomes a bit tricky is at that point, someone says, hey, I'm going to upgrade around my house. To change out a couple of gates and to change my landscaping may run me $3,000 to $5,000. And they go, well, will the insurance company meet me there? Well, let's take a hypothetical where you had a $2,500 policy. They give you a 10% discount. They're like, well, how many years does it take to get there. And I think, unfortunately, they're trying to realize all of that investment just on their insurance premiums. And many of them are choosing not to do it. And then they're non-renewed and sent to the insurer of last resort. And instead of a $2,500 premium, they've got an $8,000 premium. At which point they go, can I just go back in time 1 year? I'd be happy to spend $4,000 now that I'm going to spend an extra $5,000 every successive year. And this is an element where most of us as Americans, our fiscal view is inside the year we're in. And we have to open people's ways to what to do and how to view the financing. We've got to do both of them side by side.
And we have to think about when we can make that intervention most effectively. Is it at the time of home purchase? Is it at the refinance? Those kinds of opportunities to engage with the homeowner in those and the small business in those situations. Danielle, I think we're running up here on time, so want to end with a last question for you. ROI can be calculated in different ways. Often when we think of communities, we think of economies, but also the culture and the aspect of the community that seem irreplaceable. And if there is insurance coverage, disasters seem to be impacting these one-of-a-kind areas. A few come to mind: Lahaina, Asheville, Sanibel, and of course New Orleans. What unique considerations are there for disaster mitigation in these types of areas?
I think it's just important to drive home the point that people are always going to come back. People ask me quite uncouthly all the time, what's it going to take for people to finally give up on New Orleans? And the answer is it's going to take a whole heck of a lot, because there will always be people who come back to rebuild, no matter what the disaster is. And that's because these places are emotionally tied to us. The culture, the history, the people who have been here for 300 years have built a place that people's souls respond to. This is not just about the practicality of whether it's safe to live somewhere or not. People are going to come back to these communities. They're going to rebuild. And so we have to remember that when, the things that Carol has mentioned and Roy, we have to retrofit. We have to bring the infrastructure into place because people are coming back. And historic preservation plays such an important part of that in terms of bolstering economies and also making quality of life so much better, because places that are truly authentic with historic buildings, parks, vistas, that's the reason people keep coming back, is because those places are one of a kind in the world. They're unique and they offer something that, despite the disasters and despite the threats, people just don't want to give up on.
Thanks so much. So we have just a little bit of time left, so I want to go to each of you to give me the one idea that the audience can take away for reforming our national mitigation efforts. So Carol, maybe start with you.
So I would say that mitigation has to start with community engagement and input, that you cannot come into a community and tell them how they need to be fixed. You need to take that input and that engagement and listen to the community first, or it's not going to be successful.
Roy?
While money and the return on investment matters, particularly at the citizen level, you got to lead with survivability. If you're simply trying to make the math turn for someone, they'll zone out. But if you can focus on the survivability of their home, the idea that you will be coming back after the storm, after the fire, that can motivate.
Perfect. Danielle, last word.
Look to the past to inform the future. People who settled regions before modern technology had so many smart ideas about how to live with water, heat, cold, and we've abandoned all of that with modern systems. But a lot of lessons are there. New urbanism is old, and old techniques can actually work in the future as well.
Well, thanks so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and we'll end the session.